Sean. Thanks. I'm going to similarly just make some observations and then look forward to your questions. I would start by agreeing with a lot of what Simon said in terms of the frailness of these agreements and sort of urge you to not look at the status quo of how things have happened in the past and say, well, we'll get it through, or this is where people default to. And I think that's, in talking through to some folks in the trade world when TPA was coming up, the answer was, don't worry, people will all, they'll vote for us, and we'll, don't worry, they'll get there. And there was this feeling among a lot of folks that were pushing in industry to get members to support it that, well, they have to say these things, but at the end of the day, they'll be with us. I think that is a horrible assumption, because what you're seeing, and again, I think to Robert's point, you can walk as many surveys as you want of Beltway elites, but that's not who folks are listening to. And you look at what's happening both in terms of the House and the national the race. Look at the two really top candidates, and I'm not trying to be disparaging to Hillary Clinton, but you look at today's poll out in New Hampshire and Iowa, and Bernie Sanders is crushing, right? And so we can talk about the politics of that, but the reality is this is a guy who's out there, and now someone who was at the end of the day, an architect of this TPP deal, is now saying, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to support it in terms of Hillary Clinton. That tells you something. That if the data held up, she would be out there as a champion of this. But you've got the two leading candidates out there on the Democratic side saying hell no and probably hell no. And then you've got the leading candidate on the Republican side saying similar things. And so the idea that I think one of the mistakes sometimes is equating, okay, whatever free trade is, we can take a deal, put it in, and people will support that. And once you apply the label on it, I think that's a vastly different thing. The one anecdote, I was buying a car last weekend for the first time in 13 years, and the guy happened to see what I do for a living on the application. So my 1 hour car buying experience turned into 4.5 hours and telling me every problem the Republican Party has. My wife was like, I thought you said this is going to take an hour. So one of the things he came up at the end, he said, and I said, okay, well, he was on his rant, he said, and this TPP is ridiculous. So can I ask you a question? You're in the car business. You guys, this particular dealer deals in cars that come from somewhere else and should obviously get it. And that's the disconnect that I think is going on right now, is this idea of the intellectual argument versus the emotional reality. That people who should get it, and you talk to, we used to at USTR be like, oh, well, people who work at FedEx must get it because it's a services industry, here's how packages flow, or people who work at this particular thing. And I don't think that the average person beyond the Beltway gets it anymore in terms of how trade benefits them. Either of the way, whether it's because of the economic argument or the political argument that it creates jobs or lower prices. And you see that a lot of times where people want to shop at Walmart to get the lowest price, but they hate the goods that come in from out of the country. It's like, well, you can't have it both ways. And so I think that, to Simon's point, that there is a lack of understanding, I think, generally writ large, and this started a long time ago and it's continued to lag in terms of what people believe trade does for them and how it benefits them in the economy that they live in. And so I think the idea that people get it, and it's not that they don't get it, because I think the data bears it out. They might intellectually get how trade is good, but the personal reality of them in terms of how their wages have remained stagnant, how the jobs that they've seen less, and this is a very similar argument that dovetails into immigration right now. That there's no question, I think, writ large, we are a nation of immigrants, and it benefits us, but the way that illegal immigration has occurred over the last few years, and again, not trying to get into a policy discussion here, is that you've got people who, might be one generation out from coming to this country or suddenly hardline against immigration. You're like, that shouldn't jive, but it does because it's a difference between the intellectual argument and the emotional argument that exists right now. And I think that really sitting down and understanding that when you look at what's happened in the House of Representatives, not just the TPA vote, but with the stepping down of Speaker Boehner, that there's a lot of members right now who don't care about what people in Washington are telling them. In fact, if you look at what the leading candidates for president are talking about, it's everything that you hear from people in Washington is bad and wrong. And the people ask me all the time, like, what do you know, if you look at the top folks in the Republican Party, right now, as it stands, you've got Trump, Carly, and Carson, right? You look at that, it's about 45%. What are they talking about? How bad Washington is, how they haven't been elected before, how they'll bring a fresh perspective. And I think even on the Democratic side, despite Bernie Sanders being in Congress for a long time, being mayor, and he's been in elective office for a while, he's rallying against Washington. People are tired of hearing over and over again that this is going to fix it, and then not seeing the tangible results in their paycheck and their benefits. And I think that as this agenda moves forward, not just this current agreement or the current agreements, but going forward, I think if there's not a real understanding of the big picture problem and the attempt to go out and solve it writ large, then it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And I think industry and those who care about trade need to really stop and think, what are we willing to put on the line, and go out and educate people or have a real conversation, because people are truly pissed off. And in a lot of cases for a very good reason. And ignoring that anger and that pessimism is a huge mistake. So with that encouragement and positivity, I'll turn it back to Doug.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for all of those interesting data and observation. I guess I would maybe go to the point that Sean made about the intellectual argument versus the emotional reality. I mean, I think that that's sort of reflected in the data of the elites. I mean, that intellectually people think that free trade is good and these agreements are beneficial, but it does seem like out there generally there's a skepticism of that. But even though you say that, there's also the contradictory data where you see that Democratic voters are supportive of trade agreements and Republicans are skeptical. So it adds up to sort of a confusing picture. I guess I would just ask these four elites that we have with us here today, one of the questions that was in Bob's survey, which is, what do you think is going to happen to the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Do you see this being approved next year in the midst of the presidential election? And maybe for Simon and Sean, any advice they have on when would be the optimal timing for Congress to vote on that legislation?
Yeah. Look, I think it's going to be really hard, and I think the chaos in the House Republicans right now is not, can I hold this up? Is it okay? Other than his socks, which we have to applaud here this morning. If you didn't have your coffee, you can look at Sean's socks. This is a T-shirt being handed out on the Hill this morning that Sean happened to get coming out of the Metro, which says, you can't read it, but it says Mick Boehner. And it's being handed out by the Tea Party, sort of, conflating Kevin McCarthy and John Boehner as sort of, failed leaders. I mean, I think part of what we're seeing is, it's hard to argue there's only two parties in Washington anymore, right? And I don't really know, what's going to happen in the post-Boehner era with the trade stuff. I just think because of that, and because of the way the Republican field is playing out, if the key to passing this is holding the Republicans that we have, because we're not going to pick up many more Democrats, right? I mean, that's just not going to happen. And the emergence, if you look at the Republican presidential field right now, right? I mean, you've got a lot of anti-establishment candidates who are, we could end up with a far more populist ticket than a Chamber of Commerce Country Club Republican ticket, right? We don't really know. Rubio's holding fast on this, and Jeb Bush is as well, right, and Kasich, but I don't know that he's a serious candidate anymore. But the other folks are not, right? And so I think that the struggle inside the Republican Party over the next 6 months on whether it tilts more populist Tea Party or it sort of reverts back to a more country club, chamber of commerce kind of style is going to be a major factor in what happens. I don't think that what happens with our field is going to matter that much, right, frankly, because I just don't think you're going to see a huge variable in the Democratic vote. And so the real question is there an erosion on the Republican side? Is there a decision that this was a bad deal, like the Iran deal? And I think that, my own view of timing is that my guess is looking April, May is probably the right time. The reason why is that it's before the conventions, right? And it's after when the majority of the states, 56% of all voters are going to vote by March 15th. We're likely to have a nominee or a clear leader by March 15th. I think looking for April, May is probably the right time, is my guess. And certainly in my conversation with the White House, nobody really knows, but certainly they're aware of this, and that's sort of where they're thinking right now.